Okay, so this is Dev Book Club. We are kicking off discussions over refactoring, improving the design of existing code by Martin Fowler, the second edition. Don't be like me and look at the first edition and then have Jeremy call you out publicly and say, no, you're on the wrong edition. So we're going over the second edition. That we're going to talk about chapter 1 tonight. I'm joined by 11 other people tonight. So I'm not going to go through, and I don't think we want to waste time going through introductions of everybody. But I do want to specifically thank Jeremy Cook, who is on my screen right now, for spearheading this and kind of kicking the dust off of Dev Book Club so we can get back into the discussions. So thank you very much for that, Jeremy, and thank all of you for your participation tonight. Okay, so I guess I'll kick things off. The first chapter, I think the big takeaway for me from the whole thing was just that code intent should be obvious. And I think like I've read this book before, a few years ago, and then this is probably like my third time reading through it. And I think today, or when I read it the other day, like it was the most interesting part about it was just how purposeful refactoring is in terms of getting you to that clean code concept, but not necessarily in the academic sense, was what my takeaway was. I think previously I approached it from a really academic standpoint, as you got this catalog of refactorings and you're applying them to your code and you reach perfection or whatever. But I felt like reading it this time, it pushed me towards thinking about it differently. Like, just, you're not refactoring to reach some end goal. You're refactoring so that your code is maintainable, so your code is changeable, so that it's easier to get in. So like that was my main takeaway. And that's kind of what the theme of all my comments are going to be. So that's that. Anyone else who has a takeaway?
Yeah, I know first couple times I've tried to read this with the Java stuff. Like, I think coming at it from JavaScript being like, here's kind of this ball of wax, let's dissect it, I think really, really helps this kind of new layout that they've got. But it is very good to see that it's focusing much more toward understanding and making the code readable, not just like, this is an object, or this is a class, and this is how we need to structure these things, and this is wrong, so we need to make it better. It's more about that idea of cleaning this up so that it's maintainable, not necessarily making it the right way or any way, which I think is helpful for a lot of people. And that's one nice thing I took out of it. There's a couple things I don't know that I would do the same way he did, but he's the expert, not me.
Well, I think that speaks to the fact that there is no right or wrong way in any of these things, right? I mean, I think we all I definitely had the same reaction when I read some of this. It's like, well, why did he do it that way? Why did he do it this way? But there's so many different ways to cook an egg. And I mean, I think to Jeff's point as well, and one of the quotes that really stuck in my mind this time that I didn't pick up on the first time was towards the end of the chapter, he had this quote where he said, I think the only true measure of code quality is how easy it is to change. And I mean, I think that speaks to all of your points, right? It's about that continuous improvement mindset. And that to me really resonated when I read it this morning. I was like, we can argue until the cows come home about, is cyclomatic complexity more important than the number of arguments you pass to a method? But if it doesn't matter if the code's easy to change, which one is more important?
Absolutely.
And he specifically said he would do more performance refactoring after he had gained that clarity into the code, because it would make it so much easier to make the performance changes at that stage.
Mm-hmm. Along those lines, did anyone pick up on his very, I'm not going to call it obsessive, but his, hammer home of his loop of how he makes a small change, commits it, gets it in, like runs tests, like the whole red, green, like, and I forget the exact words that he used, but just really how that played into, I think, what you're talking about, Emily, in terms of, you gain the confidence through those small steps in the refactoring. So you're not looking at it from, hey, I'm starting here and I need to get to an end state where it's perfectly performant and it does all these things and it checks all the boxes of, no one's going to get mad at me because I didn't, use the correct design patterns here or that sort of thing, but you're making it smaller, or you're making it better in small increments, and then get to a point where, hey, now that I've done that, I have this whole history of here's the changes I made. Now I can figure out what are the actual performance penalties that I'm paying as a result of what I did, or what do I need to even do at this point? Like, I think that was cool to me.
Yeah, because I guess whatever performance test you want to do could be against past commits as well as the current commit, like compare the start and end or somewhere in the middle.
Yep.
Yeah, because I don't think he comes right out and says it. At least I don't remember if he did. But he's definitely working toward that. We're not changing the outside. We're just changing the inside. So, and that's a real big thing to keep in mind, is it's not making this overall better to the outside world, but it's just cleaning up what's there and understanding which, using the nested functions in JavaScript and only kind of altering a lot of that internally, I think helps a lot. But the goal is to make sure that we understand the working and the internals are maintainable, which I think is a big takeaway from this, is make it more maintainable. But to the outside world, nothing may have seemed to have changed in keeping that clarity to the outside world.
Right. And I think that was reinforced by the fact that he started off with writing those tests that like strictly compared the string output of the function should be exactly the same, not changing that at all.
Yeah.
I think that
this thing he also mentioned that I thought, so maybe we're just talking about steps. So like definitely the first step that he mentions is we want to get some insight of the structure, and whatever that insight is, we want to put it into the code so that we don't forget. But then the whole refactoring. So yes, the interface did not change, but really the only reason why you were cleaning up was because you did want to make a change. That was definitely a new feature that was going to be seen by the outside. So refactoring for the sake of refactoring, I don't know that he was saying like, oh yeah, just go make it pretty. But yeah, if you have to do something, then might as well make it pretty to begin with. And pretty is not the right word. Let's make it more understandable. Let's make it more readable so that it's easier for us to change it. But it is for the purpose of change, not just for the purpose of pure readability in some sense.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think that was another really good point out of the whole first chapter, was just, a lot of times we get caught up in, you're doing a code review or something and you're, oh, well, I'd probably change that. Let's refactor, let's do this. And you get caught up in, we're making changes just to appease either our own style preferences or just to say, hey, I know that we should do this, but to his point, to your point, you should, like, that is okay. I think, in my opinion, it's okay to get there, especially when you have, we have all sorts of quality tools and all sorts of stuff that do this work for us a lot of times. And that's okay. But it's also, you shouldn't go into a piece of code, especially that is, new to you or whatever, and I'm just going to change it and make it look structurally the way I want it to look, solely to make it look that way. You should instead do it because you need to do something that you can't, or that you don't even know how you would start approaching it at that point. It's the, how can I understand this code better to make the changes that I need to make, versus I don't like this, so I'm going to change it. And that's a huge trap for me. Like, personally, I'm always like, I wouldn't write it this way. Here's a better way, like for Jeff, right? Here's a better way. So we're going to do it this way, versus, we actually need to make a change and we're physically prevented because of this, or we're unsure of the impacts of making this change. And like that's a very excellent point from this chapter.
I also like the angle of you finally understand what a piece does, and then creating that function or something to actually document it for yourself, get it out of your head, so that you keep that understanding later when you've gone somewhere else. Sorry, I interrupted someone, but go ahead.
No, that's fine. I was gonna, and like what he was talking about there was, you mentioned something about your brain being the worst kind of memory, most volatile memory. I really like that line in that. But no, what I was going to bring up was going back to what Jeff was saying was about whether or not you need to refactor something. Even if it's not tested, users are using that piece of code every day in the product for, say that, if you're developing it, you have a bunch of users using it. So it is under, a whole bunch of manual testing out in production. So if there's not a reason to change it, that there's no reason to refactor it. And I thought it was interesting. He said, as soon as someone does need to understand how the code works and struggles to follow it, that's when you then have to refactor. It's when it becomes a problem to read, not a problem that it bothers you. It's when it's hard to understand. That's when you need to think about it. And at that point, it's probably that's why it's too late. You've reached that point where it's not understandable, so it requires refactoring.
For me, it's really interesting because it's like a constant temptation. And Bernard will back this up. Like, we were working on some code this week, right? Or Bernard was removing some code that I changed. I had to go in and remove something. And now necessarily to refactoring and changing some tests, well, not at the same time. But the temptation for me is always, oh, I'll just go and fix this thing. Oh, I've just noticed this other thing in investigating this thing. I'll fix that, right? And before you know it, you go down the rabbit hole. So many times I pulled myself back and was like, no, my job here is to fix this thing. I'll deal with that. And my kind of mentally, I'm like, okay, I'm only going to change this class if I'm touching this class, right? I'm not going to go and fix all the things because, yeah, I wouldn't have slept for 4 days if that was
that's a big problem we have at work. It's like you go in and here's the ticket, do this. Oh, this is junk. I'm going to rewrite all this. And instead of just marking it as like to do later or whatever, it becomes this like, okay, why you were supposed to add this feature? Why is it now an extra 20,000 lines of code? And it's like, I can't read this. Please back this off so that it's just fix it. Like, by all means, mark it as to do later. But that temptation to like fix things, like clean up a lot of that is, I think, too hard for a lot of developers. And it's hard to remember that, to just be like, just clean up where you're at. Don't clean up the entire park.
I know I've been burned by that in the past. Sorry, Antonio, go ahead.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with that. And for example, so he in this case, he had to create a version of that will create HTML, right, besides the plain text. But what about if the change was, okay, instead of 30,000 as the initial amount for comedy is 35, right? 35,000. So you look at the code, it's a single line I have to change, right? But how much refactoring do you want to do in that case?
Yeah.
That was an interesting one where it was like, I think some of the foreshadowing of, hey, we got much more complicated refactorings that we're going to have to make to eventually support new rules for, how much each thing is weighted in the system of loyalty points or whatever it's called. I forget the name. Like foreshadowing of when you're in there working on something, you're like, I think to what you were talking about in terms of, focusing on the change is I'm here to make it print out in HTML. However, I know that these 15 things are probably a problem and I'm moving this code anyway. So how much do I actually get into? And that's a huge challenge. Chris, you said this a problem, like, chasing the shiny, I guess, through the code. And a lot of times I find myself in that, and it's often like a structural problem with how things were written previously, in terms of maybe something is doing too many things, or maybe there's just, you're passing information and you're like, well, no, actually we can fix all of this if I just, cut this out and like extract this method. And now that should actually be a class. Then you end up with that whole hodgepodge. Like, I don't even know if there is a right answer to figure out how do you decide whether what you're doing is good or bad in the context. I think it goes back to that it's kind of subjective to me, but that whole, is this readable and understandable? So like, you're in there making the change to change like the weight of something, like you were talking about, Antonio, but should you, if you figured out eventually it took you one line, the problem is the hour it took you to figure that out. Could you refactor to cut that time down for the next person, even if that next person is you in 2 months when you have to change it to something else? I think that's the line, but how do you get there? I don't know.
I think it's definitely worthwhile to add the clarity now while you've got your head around it, because otherwise you will be back in that part of the code and you will have to get your head back around it again. So, I mean, I guess unless you're under a real big deadline, you should probably go ahead and make it more readable and understandable at the time that you're in it, because otherwise you've just doubled the amount of effort somebody has to go through that code.
There's an aspect of the first chapter that I think is kind of interesting, which is that he chooses to go down this idea of like, yeah, we can go down histories and principles and all this other stuff, but I'm just going to show you an example. And I think it's sort of like it's implicit versus explicit that by the end of the chapter, you're supposed to agree that, yes, this is better than what it was before. And I think what maybe the first chapter lacks, that I'll be interested to see if future chapters have this, is this idea of like, how do I recognize when it is that I need to refactor? Is it that I'm trying to now mimic what I'm seeing in this first chapter where I've got this big hunk of, code blocks that I want to like split out into different pieces? And I think we all kind of like have like different interpretations of what that looks like as just like individual people. And so it'll be interesting to see like, is there going to be kind of like, in addition to like all the different ways to do it, is it going to be like, how do I know when this is a problem,
Yeah. Maybe it's something we can think about over the coming weeks. Like, a question in my mind right now, and I don't know how to voice this. It's like, when do you stop refactoring? Like, he clearly had an example here, right, where you had this giant lump of code and then he started two new features. So you could say the scope of his refactorings were, it was the correct thing to do for the scope of the things he needed to add, the number of changes he made. But in other cases, like Antonio said, you stop when the code is perfect. I like that. There you go, Jeremy. But I mean, like Antonio said, if you're only changing one tiny thing, how far do you go? Like, is there some general heuristic that we can use to guide ourselves?
Well, I would say, first off, the change needs to be understandable by the other people on your team, assuming you're coding in a team. So making a huge change and doing a whole bunch of refactoring, even though it may be better if it's 50 files and you're supposed to only do one thing, immediately everyone who's reviewing that PR should just be like, what did you do? Why did you do that? And that's, I think, the biggest waste of time anybody can have in a team is that lack of communication and not communicating well through the changes. So I think when you need to change something, that's when you do it, and only change what you need to change.
Yeah, I think those are good bookends. Like in here, it's, I don't understand this code, how to add an HTML output. So the refactoring becomes, what is this code doing? Can I make it more understandable? And the end goal is, I've rendered HTML. That's where we stop. We could worry about more output formats and things like that, like what happens with PDFs now. But at the very least, like, we can render plain text. That's all good the way it used to work. We can do HTML. This looks pretty extensible. Like, I think those are two good bookends. We could go way further, but I think that a good starting point with a lot of this, like he shows, is, I don't understand it. Let's clean this up. Because if I don't understand it, someone else probably doesn't understand it either.
Yeah, I prescribe to the prepare to make the change, then make the change. So I would have done these as like two separate PRs, with the team. Be like, okay, we've refactored this, we've cleaned it up. Now we're ready to, make the change we want to make.
I think that's the key. Like what you both just said is the key to, make only the changes necessary. Like, but who's the arbiter of necessary? You could argue that it's you as the author of the PR. You could also argue that it's whoever needs to approve it before you get it merged. Yeah, I don't know. I think that's like the trickiest part, just in general. But I think like what I think Emily was referencing earlier in terms of, do the work that is necessary to get you to the point where you understand how to make the change of whatever you're trying to do, and then nothing more, no matter how tempting it is. Because I know I was reading the end result in this chapter, and I was like, yeah, but you could totally fix like HTML and plain text, not the only things. Like I could totally see how you would change this. Now let's add another thing in front of it. And it's like, wait, no, we don't need to do that. And we have other problems that we've already introduced for ourselves to solve later. So I think at that point, it's that tweets have been going around about, if you submit a PR that has 5 lines of code changed, you're going to get 300 comments from every person you work with. You submit one that has 10,000 lines and they say, yeah, this looks good, merge it. Like that's so like, I guess balance it out towards getting it merged. I'm just kidding. Like, don't do that. Like, just balance it out to, hey, I understand this. Hopefully everyone else does, and then work from there. Like, that's how I try to approach it and fail usually, but you do what you got to do.
Unfortunately, in my experience, I don't think a lot of people have that discipline that he's subtly introducing about making very tiny changes, committing, testing, and then go to the next change. Most people, I mean, I don't know if it's habit or if it's some other kind of technical, barriers, but they tend to just make all the changes that they think they need, however big they are, and then just say, okay, I think I'm done. Go look at this. And I've been on some code reviews that are, tricky because it's hard to follow along. There's too much. It takes you, probably way longer than it should, especially if you mix refactorings with the actual changes you needed to make. But I think that discipline, especially people starting out in the industry, I think that's tough to kind of ingrain. Maybe it comes with experience, but it shouldn't be overlooked.
I think it's tricky even with experience, right? I mean, I was reading his steps, and like for me, naturally, I would probably skip a bunch of them, like in terms of how small he broke out his steps. I think just my brain wants to like jump ahead. It's like, oh yeah, I know, I can just do this, and then I'll do this next one right away in one go. And I think with experience, you probably start skipping more steps. So I think it's a good reminder for sure.
He talked about that a little bit. I think he said something along the lines of, sometimes I'll be tempted to, think 5 steps ahead, and then, I know what I'm going to end up with, or I think I know, and then you inevitably get bitten by not having those small increments. Like, and I definitely don't do this, and I probably should, but you're in a big refactor, you're like, oh, I'm going to rename some things. So you rename it, and then you change this, you change that. And even with all your IDE tools, like eventually you get to a point where you're like, okay, now how did this start out? So now you're pulling up like old revisions. You're like, what was this called before? Why did I change it to this? And like, totally get that, the discipline is probably, I would say, I would agree with you, Jason. It's probably harder the more experience you get, because you're like, I've done this 10 times. I know I'm going to end up calling it this. And like the thing that got me in this chapter is he talked about his kind of standard practice for, I make a function, I make a method, I make a variable called result, and then I return that at the end. And I've seen a comment recently where someone was saying, my advice to all junior developers is always make a temporary variable and return that, because some, senior programmer or whatever is going to come in behind you and want to put debugging steps in there. So always do this. It has a general practice. And I was like, but I hate that so much. Like, my first instinct is always, whenever I see a temporary variable, say, how can I kill this? Because it is terrible. Like, I just can't stand it. But then here he is like saying, no, this is my total practice. And I think I don't know. I think you just have to come up with rules that work for you and for your team and your project. And how do you get to the point where it's going to be? And so it's probably just a sprinkle of this here, sprinkle of that there is the right answer. Like, I don't think that there's a universal rule for this particular issue. Like, of whether,
because you'll notice he got rid of the temporary variable in the end.
Yeah.
That was one of those. I'm like, I'm not particularly keen on the call this same function 5 times in the function.
Oh yeah,
as a replacement, but like he ended up, getting rid of that. So I think it's important. That's one of those balance things that comes with the code. Like, I probably would have left that variable in because I wouldn't call it temporary because you're using it multiple places.
Mm-hmm.
But to just have a generic, like, worry about debugging later. Like, I see this a lot in like a lot of PHP programs. Like, that I think is a tooling issue, because like things like xdebug, you don't need the temporary variable. You can always step debug. But I think that's definitely an experience issue to know I don't need this because I can get it other ways, versus leave that in there because I want to debug later.
But yeah, what happens when you have 5 levels deep, right? So you have a function that is calling a function that is returning the result of another function is 5 times, right? And it's kind of, at some point, introducing that variable helps, right? So yeah, I was kind of unsure about what he was doing.
I could see it pains me. Like it's painful to see it. And I don't know, maybe that's a personal preference thing, but like, I don't know. I like when he talked about how he, what you were referencing, Chris, like when he, replaced the temp variable with just a function call every time. I was just like, man, that's the first thing I would see in the code review. Like I would not be able to get past that. I would just look at it and say, why are you doing this? Like all my years of working in Ruby and everything, it's like you memorize everything and like, just no, like this is not a good idea. Like we want a local result. We don't need to compute it 15 times. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's
The interesting one there. Sorry, Jeff.
No, go ahead.
Also, the interesting one for me was to do the most readable thing, and then like I think he pointed this out. Hopefully he pointed out in this chapter. So I'm not getting ahead in the book, but do the most readable thing, and then if you see a performance problem, optimize then. I think he definitely talks about that with performance issues. I mean, we could argue whether or not having a temporary variable or a local variable or calling the method multiple times and doing the thing all those times is more readable. But the big thing, I guess, in the first chapter for me from that was the cost of doing it multiple times is probably going to be so negligible that you don't need to worry about it. But we worry so often. Like the big one in this again for me was split loop refactoring. That we go like, oh, we've got a loop. I'll just put all the things in the loop, and then before you know it, the loop is massive, and that tends to be a massive place where we tend to abuse code, I think. So this idea of the cost of iteration is probably so small. And by the time the compiler or the interpreter is done with what you've written, who knows what's actually being executed? Was a huge one for me.
Just always remember you have two compilers, right? You have your brain compiler where you're reading it, and then you have the actual compiler, which is way better at optimizing that stuff than like to me, it's like the whole, you have a function that you're calling or a method or whatever, and you're calling it multiple times to get, I'm trying to think of an example out of the book, but he was like pulling something out of the play, like he's pulling some data out of the play. He just repeated that like 5 or 6 times. And it's like, yeah, I get what it's doing. But every time I reach that in the code, I'm like, oh yeah, that pulls this out of the play, versus if I had a variable that was like named whatever that thing is that you're reaching for, it would make a lot more sense to me. It'd be easier for my brain compiler to understand it, even though maybe it's bad, maybe it's not, in terms of cleanness of the refactoring, right?
Yeah. I want to touch on.
I don't think he goes into the argument of why he's doing it. I don't think he explains too deeply why. But if we could jump a couple of steps and the whole principle of making it easy to change, it definitely does. The temporary variable, it's in the middle. At any point, that chunk of code in between when that variable gets set and any other part of the code using it could get modified, and then you get weird results. It isolates the thing. So I don't know if it makes it more readable. I mean, it doesn't make it less readable, I don't think. I mean, you still get the same sense. But like if you believe in the whole functional paradigm and the kind of benefits that come with that, I guess you will be convinced that you want to go down that route versus having the temporary variable everywhere.
I think it's a bad example because he's using it as a data access, and it's like, stop querying for that, because he's pulling the performance out of a list of other performances, and like you look at that and you're like, that would be a database call every single time,
most likely. Yeah,
but that's for the example. Like I totally get why he did that. I think it was probably just a poor example for it.
it is an interesting observation that you made, Gerardo. Like maybe it's, he talked about how the first step that he takes in any refactoring is always look for the local variables and figure out why they're wrong. So maybe it's like maybe that's just a tell that he's setting the code up for future refactorings of his own, the way that he does things. And it's like maybe we're all getting hung up, or I say we all, like maybe I'm getting hung up on this because it's just a personal preference thing that he's just small exampling in the book, and it wouldn't actually be like that in real life. So yeah, I don't know.
One sentence that did stand out to me was he wrote, temporary variables are only useful within their routine, promoting long, complex routines. So it seems like he's making the argument that this is good, clean code wise, but he didn't really elaborate beyond that. But this could just be his personal view of temporary variables in general and what he tries to do.
But he was talking about them within a certain scope. So it wasn't like a temporary variable that was in like a huge piece of code collectively, that it was just being carried down the way. It was very well encapsulated, which kind of makes it seem like that's not very helpful for debugging, in my opinion. But I don't know. I don't quite get how the person would use that in debugging. So
I guess I don't know. Like I know I've seen tweets around that whole concept, and maybe it's, hey, you can just die dump the variable easier. You don't have to copy and paste it and remove the return statement. Maybe that's the whole thing. And if so, I mean, you could take that practice and put it away, because it's not. I don't know. I don't subscribe to that. So
I want to pick up quickly on two things Jason said earlier. Like you were talking about, it would be so easy to put a bunch of these steps together and do a bigger step that he did. And I think for me, two things that I learned in the last couple of years that were really key for making me take small steps were, well, the first one of which, there's a wonderful presentation by Martin Fowler and Willie Sewell called Refactoring in Small Steps. And their mantra is 2 minutes to better code. That at any point, you should be no more than 2 minutes from committing and walking away. If your manager comes in and says, this thing over here is on fire, I need you to drop everything and go and work on this, you can bank your 2 minutes of changes. You've made the code better in some way, and you can just go. Right? And so to do that involves taking tiny steps. After every single step, the code always runs, your test always pass. Like if the minute your test doesn't pass, you undo and you go back. So that was one thing I really liked and has helped me a lot. The other one of which I find for myself, and I don't know if anyone else feels this, is that the bigger the step I take, the more likely it is I've got blinkers on mentally, because all I'm seeing is the end result. Whereas if I take tiny steps, I'm much more open to what the code is telling me. And I tend to find that when I do that, I end up in a better place, because the code tells me things as I make these tiny steps, and then I see possibilities that I never saw. Whereas if I take the big step, all I can see is the one direction that I've got in my mind. I don't know if anyone else finds the same, or if that's just me, but it's an interesting exercise. Like, I mean, I'd encourage anyone, I guess, to try taking tiny steps and see where you go for a while. I mean, it's going to be different for everyone, right? I'm not saying you must do it this way. Just, it's an interesting exercise to try.
I just had a great idea for like a chaos monkey for development teams. You could add something to everyone's development environment that just every couple minutes just takes whatever their last work in progress commit was and pushes it live, to really force the whole very small commits frequently, and it must be working.
No longer work in progress, but works in production.
Yeah, works in production.
I look forward to hearing how that goes in your company, Jeff.
Oh yeah, well I was thinking maybe like we could pilot it with your team.
Nice, okay.
That's cool, yeah. Sorry.
We're way away from there yet, but maybe eventually. Right. Yeah.
For anybody that has had the opportunity to read the TDD book, I think there was a lot of, being thrown in your face without being thrown in your face, and I do think that it's cool to see kind of like their interaction between their refactoring practices and the testing practices, and I guess he says he's going to have a whole chapter about testing eventually in the chapter. So that should be interesting. But yeah, in the test-driven development book, they also, obviously a big part of it is the small steps, and I do find that it's very difficult when you don't understand things. And so I think the solution is given to us here, which is that when you don't understand things, you still only go small to try to understand one thing, and then you isolate that, and then you once again go look at it and find another thing that you don't understand. Once you understand it, you separate it, and then just continue. And the whole time you're also writing tests. So a little bit of fitting into the two practices together, which I found useful, because sometimes I do feel paralyzed. I don't know what the next small test that I should write is.
He did say something interesting, I think, related to that whole topic of, working in small sets and then making sure you're testing them and pushing them, or committing them at least in workable states. And that was something along the lines of when you're writing your tests, you have to make the same exact mistake twice if it's going to break in your code and in your test. And I think that may be the secret to figuring out how to get to a point where you're making these small commits is, ensuring that you're working in that whole TDD cycle. Cause I know, I'm a firm believer in it. However, a lot of times it's like, hey, I know what code I want to write. So let me write it real quick. And then let me write a test that proves that what I wanted to write is what I should have written, versus let me write a test that proves I'm wrong all the time. And it's like, I should try to prove myself wrong more so than I try to prove myself right, but human nature and all. But I think getting into that habit of working in the TDD cycle and really, how do you verify the refactorings when you don't have a test for it? Like, you can't. So if you're forced to work in that cycle, it kind of lends itself very easily to every time I've written a test, it's failed, I fixed it, and then I've passed it. That is I'm done. That's a commit. That is something that you could get into that whole workflow. I could see that working. Could also see it being a, massive productivity hit the first, 30 days or so of trying to work that into your flow. So, I don't know. I'm not going to say right now that I'm going to commit to it, but I do agree with it in principle, at least.
I think there's a big difference between my code base has tests and my code base doesn't, and trying to get those to work. Because since a lot of this is going to revolve around legacy code anyway, just that simple, real basic, like, does my output match what it currently does? Like, that's the baseline, all I can deal with right now. I'm not going to worry about getting 100% test coverage or anything like that. Just like, can I continue to get this thing to render the way that I have right now? That can be a huge challenge. Like, this is a pretty simple code, but like that's usually the biggest time sink. Once that's in, the quick turnaround time, I think, should be pretty good. One thing I did like with this was that, in the end, he was saying, I have a lot more code, but it's healthier. And that's one thing I see a lot of. It's like, your commit should be small. They should be taking away code, making things better, but that's not always how this works out. Like, more maintainable code does not mean shorter code.
Yeah.
That was I like that takeaway from this.
Yeah, I wrote that down. If all else is equal, more code is bad, but rarely is all else equal, is what he said. And I think that's absolutely true. Like, and I'm definitely guilty of, being proud of commits that are like 0 lines added, 999 lines deleted, like, hey, let me post that to Twitter. That's like an instant, look what I did. And it's like, that's the exception. That's not the rule. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a balance, right? Of, what changes am I making, and whether it's more, whether it's less, what your changes are, as long as the readability, like, how do you measure readability? It's not like lines changed. It's, I don't know, like, maybe we could start measuring how long people are taking to review code and say, like, it took you a long time. You opened it 15 times. If you open my PR 15 times and don't comment, it means that I did a terrible job writing something you understand.
I can
So I
stand
should probably
behind that.
Explain my changes back to me.
Yeah.
I have a couple of coworkers who push these big PRs, and I will look at them and I'm just like, not today. I can't today. Go away, come back, save it for a morning, because you can't go into that at the end of the day. Brain explodes.
That's
But I think the difference between the code he ended up with and the code he started out with is that things were named more sensibly for what they were doing, and there was a lot more space. And that white space of curly braces and parentheticals is so much easier to follow than a big procedural chunk of do all the things at once.
definitely. I think to the other point, probably the most enabling feature that GitHub has ever released is that one where you can click, I've viewed this file already. Because it's like, you open someone's Giganto PR and you're like, oh, this is nice. Let me just spend, 30 minutes. I've looked at this file. There's changes in it. Cool. Yep. Okay. And then you just go down the list. And by the time you've hidden all the files, you say, looks good to me, merge it, even though you haven't actually reviewed it. Like, I think, yeah. So like getting to the point where what he's done in this chapter of pulling it back to something that is, yes, and I think he talked about like, yes, it is more code in terms of lines, but it's not more code in terms of how much you have to understand at any given point. And I think that's the key is like, how do you break things down into something that is the smallest cognitive load at any piece of the puzzle? And that I think is the goal is how do I take what was 40 lines of code that you have to understand all 40 lines to know what it's doing and break it down into, if you want to know what this piece is doing, you need to understand these 3 lines and that's it. Like that's, I think where, or how you get to the point of saying, yes, my refactoring is complete is once it's very easily broken down into chunks that make sense to you. And then to the next level would be whoever's reading it in code review. And then the level that you may not have to worry about is the person who's reading it in 5 years when they're rewriting the application. And you're like, I no longer work here, so I don't care. But that's the next level. Like try to get to that point, right?
One of the factors he mentioned that stuck out to me when you're trying to figure out whether more of the, like having more code is better was if most of the changes to the code are to play types and calculations, then having more code here is with a more clearly separated structure is better. So I was thinking about that in terms of, okay, so if you do have a good idea of where the extensibility in what you're refactoring is going to happen in the future, then you can use that as a decision point on where you can be a little more wordy, for lack of a better word, and where maybe the refactoring isn't worth it.
One of the my favorite things that someone's ever told me is I worked with a client who it was like I was at an agency and the client was our client but they were developers too, and we worked on their platform together. And we would run into cases where we would have these complex conditionals, maybe 2, maybe 3 comparisons in a condition. And he said, anytime I see that, I just want to break that out into a well-named method so that when I'm reading this function and I'm trying to understand what's happening in here, I could just read the well-named method and I can go look into it if I need to. And I've like carried that with me everywhere I've gone ever since, and share it with everybody. Like, let's split this out as much as possible so we get down to that smaller part, have it read like a book.
When I've talked about this, but like I've given talks on like how do you get to clean code, and like I still think I don't do this as much anymore, but like I still think the idea of what you're talking about is I'm looking at something that has a clearer set of 5 steps that it's doing, like some method is doing 5 steps to get from point A to point B. So there should be 5 methods in there that are like 5 calls that just say do this, do that, do this, and like so a lot of times when I'm working on something that I don't yet understand, I'll write out comments that are like step 1, this, step 2, this, and then say, okay, let me go fill that in with code. And then let me take those and should these be methods? And then eventually you end up a lot of times saying, this doesn't even belong in here. Like this goes somewhere else entirely. And so you're pulling it out somewhere else. And I think that's kind of the progression to get to what you were talking about in terms of, you look at conditionals, and I don't need to know the 13 different states that really make up this one thing. I just want to know what is the goal here? Like, does this have this condition? And I can write that in a sentence, so I can make that a method. And like, that's the I think the trick getting there. But it's a journey more than it is like a, first, like I can instantly do that by looking at code. Absolutely not. Like it usually takes an entire chapter of a book to get there, right? Like that's.
I wonder if that speaks to the process as well, because the thing I love about this example is that he doesn't say, this is my end goal, this is my end state. Like a lot of people approaching refactoring think that they have to know what the end goal is. And then every step has to be a perfect step along a single path towards reaching that goal. Whereas in fact, it's really, you don't know where your next step is going to be after 1 or 2 steps, right? And you've got a vague idea of where you're going, but during the path of the refactoring, maybe where you're going changes completely. So I love the sense of this example that he just approaches it very organically. Like he goes and is like, you know what, I'm going to make these names better. Oh, now I've made the names better. I can see where to do some function extractions. And now I've done that. I can see that we really need to split phase and blah, blah. And he gets to this end result that's better without needing to know where he's going to start with.
So you're saying that we shouldn't try to make like a refactoring Gantt chart. It's like you assign a ticket to somebody and you say, give me a Gantt chart showing me your refactoring steps, how long they're going to take. And then at the end, we'll have this result. And you're saying that's probably not a product that I should be building right now. Is that what you're saying?
Well, if I don't let me stop you launching that product, Jeff. If you find the market, go for it.
Oh, I'm sure there's a market. I don't think that we should encourage the market, but I'm sure there is one.
Okay.
That's very interesting, Jeremy, because I got the completely opposite sense. Like I didn't see in the book like the art or the science of the developer. To me was very like, I don't understand this. I want to understand one thing. I understood it. Now that goes into a function, very mechanical.
Right.
Then after that, like I have a new function. I need to do certain things to this function. I need to figure out what my temporary variable for my result is. I change that name. I change the property name. I look at some things in there. I realize that maybe there is some more refactoring in the function, move on to the next step. So it is kind of interesting. So I can see what you're talking about, that there, it is, like the first part of like, I don't understand something, that's very vague and you might not know where that might take you. But after the ball started rolling, I did feel like there was something sort of mechanical and kind of like very specific principles that he held in his own head, that some of those we don't share.
Yeah.
But whatever was driving him was like very principled, very mechanical, very step-by-step. At least that's how I was perceiving it. So very interesting that you saw it a little different.
It's also possible that I'm, spoiler alert, that I'm colored. What I'm saying is colored by having read the book before. I don't know, and maybe you may have read it as well before. I don't know, but I could be putting that interpretation onto something that wasn't necessarily there in the first chapter. But
I think what I took from what you were saying, Jeremy, is and also like aligns with what your disagreement is, Gerardo, is like he didn't start out looking at the initial problem and saying, I need to get to a point where I'm writing out HTML and say, I know exactly what this block of code is going to look like. Like I know exactly how to get, or I know exactly what it's going to look like at the end. Instead, he said, I know I need to do this one thing. And then it was a journey of a bunch of small little journeys. And so that was like the tactical side of, he has this catalog of small trips he can take that result in a long journey. So like, it's like, instead of building an itinerary that says, I'm going to do these 17 different refactorings to get to destination, he says, I need to get to destination. How do I get started? Like he's doing the whole executive function thing of like, I need to get there. What's the first thing I do? And that's, I look in here, and to him, it apparently is look for temporary variables and then start there. Like that's your first boom. I'm going to get rid of those. And like that, maybe that's a good place to start. And so I think it's kind of in between what both of you are saying, which is it's a long journey, but you don't necessarily know what the destination should be, but you don't know how you're going to get there necessarily. And then you get there by slowly repeating journeys that you've already taken or repeating trips you've already made inside the process. I think to me, that's what I heard, but
Yeah, I like that. I like that.
But is this the way you will approach this problem in real life? So here you have to create different report, right? HTML, you have to have HTML and plain text. So to make things, okay, we need to separate the phases of calculation from presentation. And that's the first thing I would try to look, right? Instead of, okay, I'm going to start my battery of refactoring and changing local variables and all of this. Seems like, I don't know if his way of introducing the topic, but at the beginning, it would look like it was refactoring, but for the sake of refactoring.
I can agree with that. I think, yeah, I mean, and of course, part of it is probably also, he did mention this in the book, but he was like, it's very difficult when you're trying to present something like this. You have your choice to make. Do I give you a simple example where I know the result effectively? And like that may be what we're picking up on is he was refactoring for the sake of refactoring, like you're saying, because he knew he needed to, and he needed an example to show us how, versus, or do I spend like 300 pages explaining some very complicated problem where he wouldn't be able to know the end result ahead of time? And I think that's probably what we're seeing. I mean, that's what it looks like to me, but yeah, I think that in real life, what you're saying, Antonio, I think is that, in real life, you're never gonna be at a point where the end result is something you really can keep in your head. Like you know what you're trying to do, your small piece, which is that whole, I would need to change it to spit out HTML. You likely don't know the entire context of the rest of the application, or if you do your, some sort of a database yourself. So like, you don't know, you're not gonna be able to keep that context in your head enough that you'd be able to guess what the end result is. So it may initially feel like you're refactoring just for the sake of refactoring, but it's probably more of a habit almost. Like you start out and this area I'm going to impact. So what am I looking at? What are the players involved? Let me look at this one. Okay, this is messy because of this variable here. So I am kind of refactoring just for the sake of doing it, but I'm also refactoring because experience has told me that to get to there, I'm going to have to do some changes here so that I'll be able to even mess with these things. That may be, I would consider that an acceptable trade-off.
I wonder if it seems like an example, like in this particular scenario, it'd be more realistic if his end result was I actually am adding like another play type and I'm getting into this code base, and I was tasked with it, doing this feature, and I got into here and I'm like, oh, this is really hard to follow. It's hard to make this change easily. I could just put it in this switch statement in this long thing and be done with it and put my calculations in there. But I actually want to make it better for next time. So next time I just have to add a new object that does what it needs to do.
Mhm.
Depends on whether you want to inflate your billable hours, right?
Right.
That's
Who's paying for
that
it?
question. Who's paying for this? Yeah.
Those are
think,
some salary are missing out, right?
This example, definitely has some bias, and he's going to pick something he knows he has to refactor. The book is called Refactoring. He's not going to start with perfect code and just like try to force it in there. And second of all, it's the second edition, so he's probably done it before. People have edited. He's probably looked at it 20 times. So he's going to give you a pretty good example of, yeah, this is some really crappy code, and I'm going to show you exactly, maybe even the most optimal way to do it. And I bet if you were to ask him to do it again, he probably wouldn't get the result in the same way. But to me, it didn't take anything away from it. I thought, yeah, of course this is ideal, but still, just seeing him walk through some of those things, like I'm going to do this and this, and in really small steps, to me, that was the benefit. And thank God we have IDEs that do these things, because who's going to remember the names and how to do all those things, exactly right, so they compile and test pass. But the example being like just a good example of refactoring, even though he said I want to keep it small but not too simple. I'm fine with it. It'd be nicer to see him do it live, of course, And I've had the fortune of seeing Uncle Bob do things live, and I'm sure he's practiced those things many times, but every time it'll be slightly different, or someone will ask a question and then make him do it a different way. So, I mean, you get to still see the genius of working through it, step by step.
I would like to see go ahead.
I was going to say, the next book I'm going to write is Nuke It from Orbit, just to be sure. Though, because he goes through this refactoring example, but we're adding these features. Sometimes, I feel like it's just easier to just start over and not refactor. I know this book is refactoring, and that's what we're going to go through is all the steps of refactoring. But it's not necessarily going to be easier to refactor. It might be easier to start over. So there's always that consideration to make.
Yeah. I've been introduced to some interesting philosophies around code as commodity, or code as, hey, what do we do with this? Let's just write it off. Let's treat it as an asset that we built, and every 3 years just drop it and start over. It's much easier that way. I've been on both sides of that particular coin, and I agree with you that it is. A lot of times it is easier to just rewrite things than it is to go through the pain of refactoring. Hey, Jeremy, thanks for coming here. But I mean, I think at the end, you're probably almost always in a better state for having refactored it and worked through the problems than you are for rewriting it. Because most of the time, in my experience, when I've rewritten something, I tend to take a lot of context that I don't even know exists and throw it away, because it's oh, I don't know why this line was there, so let me just kill it. And I would say that's probably a mistake 9 times out of 10, but 1 time out of 10, it's the right answer. How do you figure out those odds? I don't know. It's exercise for the reader, right? What I would love to see from this chapter in this book in general is all the examples that he started that didn't work out to fit in. So what is the example that you started writing for this first chapter that didn't actually get you to a refactoring state that made sense? I would love to see that just from sample to what we're talking about right now is,
And I was going to bring up too that this example felt like it was going to be, he was testing strings, I guess, which is the simplest thing, but let's say it's a little bit more complicated than that. I mean, your tests may not carry through to the end. You may be writing new tests if you're adding new features. So, your approaches are going to change based on that. I think it's it's a kind of a trivial example, so that the tests are trivial. But yeah, as soon as you start having dependencies and things like that, none of these examples had external dependencies to bring in. So.
Yeah, or if you're working in a code base with badly written fragile tests.
That's kind of a trap, right? Which that I think that's a trap. You end up, we tend to put tests on this pedestal of, you have to have tests before you can do refactoring, and therefore, you have to write these things, and then once they're written, they're in stone. They're the definition of what it should do, and therefore there's no chance that you should delete them. And I disagree with that entirely. You get to a point where it's this no longer makes sense to have this test. And yes, if I delete it, if I change the code and then it breaks, that doesn't mean that I need to keep the test. It's a part of the process of I've changed things structurally, or I've changed things that this behavior doesn't work the same way it did. And so example of, you extracted something and moved it somewhere else. Yeah, you're gonna have to rewrite a new test. Does it mean you have to take the exact same test? Not necessarily. You want to take the outputs that make sense, and the outputs that actually satisfy the problem, not the fact that what's in the test and all the collaborators and yada yada. I think it's okay to delete tests. I think you should. And if you're not, then there's probably something wrong. Your code is not evolving if you're not deleting tests.
I want to pick up on Antonio's point. Sorry. No, go. Just a little bit earlier that Antonio, you were saying do you really do this in real life? And I wonder. I was thinking about that because I wonder if this is a general heuristic with this. Because thinking about it, for me, I think my approach differs slightly in code that I don't know well versus code that I know well. And I think in code that I know well, I was talking earlier about how you don't know what the next step is necessarily, or you see 1 or 2 steps in front of you. You don't see more than that. For me, I think if I know the code well, maybe that journey is a little more mapped out in my mind. Like I know where I want to be, and I've got a better idea of the steps I'm going to take. Where if I'm tackling a piece of code that I really don't know well, then I really only see that one step, right? Because for me at that point, part of the refactoring is that's what gets me to the point where I understand how the code works. So and again, maybe that speaks to your point, Antonio, that how much you actually do this in real life maybe depends on how familiar you are with the piece of code that you've been asked to change.
Yeah, my point was more about intentionality, right? So
yeah, okay.
Start with, okay, we have to separate, right, this calculation from presentation instead of like aimlessly going through this refactoring kind of library, right? Okay.
So
yeah, right.
I think should probably wrap this up. But I think like what you're talking about right now is like the last quote that I wrote down out of the chapter was, brevity is the soul of wit, but clarity is the soul of evolvable software. And I think that's kind of what you're getting to is don't get to the point where you're refactoring because you're supposed to refactor, but refactor so that the intent and the clarity of the code is what you're working towards. And so like, I think the simplicity of the example kind of leads you down a path of, hey, we've refactored just so we could see what refactoring is all about. But I think that the mark is, am I doing this or am I making this change to improve the clarity or to really show what the intent of this particular code or this block of code is? Or am I refactoring because I think I should? And you should not refactor just because you need to increase your commit or your number of lines of code in your contribution graph or whatever. You should commit so that someone else will understand the code better. Most likely yourself in 6 months in general. So, okay. That was chapter 1. I think we're a little over time, but thank you all for your participation tonight. We'll meet again next week covering chapter 2. And I think that's all I have.
Thank you very much.